Before anyone held you, before anyone spoke your name, before the world decided whether you were impressive, useful, difficult, lovable, or easy to forget. Who saw you first? It is a question most people never think to ask. We spend our lives trying to be noticed by eyes that are often tired, distracted, wounded, or turned towards someone else. We learn to measure our worth by the speed of a reply, the warmth of a welcome, the sound of applause, or the empty chair beside us. But Psalm 139 begins somewhere deeper than human attention. It begins before anyone understands you, before anyone misunderstands you, before anyone stays, and before anyone leaves. It begins with a God who does not discover you slowly. He knows you already. On the night Hannah Mercer finally opened that psalm again, rain was pressing against the windows of St. Gabriel Medical Center in long silver lines. It was almost 4 in the morning, the hour when even a crowded hospital seems to forget how to breathe. The elevators opened with soft chimes to empty corridors. The vending machines hummed beside rows of plastic chairs. Somewhere far down the east wing, a monitor sounded twice and then stopped. The fluorescent lights made everything look pale and unfinished, as if the building itself were waiting for morning to decide what kind of day it would become. Hannah had been awake for 19 hours. Her dark hair was tied in a loose knot that had begun to fall apart. A faint red mark crossed the bridge of her nose where her mask had rested. Her shoes made almost no sound against the polished floor, though every step seemed to rise through her knees and settle in her back. She carried a paper cup of coffee she had forgotten to drink. It had gone cold more than an hour ago, but she kept holding it because an empty hand felt strangely exposed. All night, people had called her name. "Nurse Hannah? Hannah? Could you help? Hannah? Can you explain this? Hannah? My father is scared. Hannah? My wife cannot sleep. Hannah? I do not know what to do." She had answered every voice she could. She had pulled blankets higher over shaking shoulders. She had explained test results in simpler words without pretending to know what the doctors had not yet said. She had found an extra chair for a son who refused to leave his mother's room. She had stood beside a frightened woman while an orderly wheeled her toward surgery. She had brought warm water to an old man who apologized for needing anything at all. Hannah had done what she always did. She had noticed the details. She had remembered who took tea without sugar, who needed the hallway light left on, who smiled bravely only when family was watching. She noticed everyone. No one noticed that her hands trembled when she was tired. No one noticed that she had been wearing the same small silver necklace for 6 months because it was the last gift her mother had given her. No one noticed that whenever a patient called out for his mother in confusion, something inside Hannah stopped moving for a moment. No one noticed that she had not gone home after her previous shift, but had slept in her car for 40 minutes because the silence in her apartment felt heavier than exhaustion. People saw her competence. They saw the calm voice, the quick steps, the badge clipped neatly to her pocket. They saw what she could carry. They did not see what carrying it was doing to her. Perhaps you know that kind of invisibility. It does not always look like being alone. Sometimes it looks like being surrounded by people who know your role but not your heart. It looks like being the dependable one, the strong one, the person everyone calls when something breaks. It looks like remembering birthdays no one remembers for you. It looks like listening carefully while your own story waits behind your teeth. It looks like laughing at the right moment, showing up on time, answering, serving, working, caring, and then wondering why you feel as though your real life is happening in a room no one can enter. That night, Hannah had almost reached the staff exit when her phone vibrated in her pocket. For one foolish second, hope rose in her before she could stop it. Maybe Daniel had finally replied. Maybe her younger brother had read the message she sent 3 days earlier about sorting through their mother's things. Maybe he had written more than... busy this week. We will figure it out." But the screen showed only a pharmacy notification reminding her to refill a prescription. Hannah stared at the white light of the phone until it dimmed. Then she slipped it back into her pocket and stood beneath the red exit sign without moving. The rain had become harder. Beyond the glass doors, the parking lot shimmered beneath street lamps. Her car was out there somewhere, beaded with water, waiting to take her to the apartment where her mother's blue scarf still hung over the back of a chair. Hannah could picture the room exactly. The unopened mail, the clean cup beside the sink, the narrow strip of moonlight that would fall across the floor. She could also picture herself entering, locking the door, turning on the lamp, and discovering that grief had arrived before her counter. Grief was always there first now. It sat in the quiet places. It knew the shape of every room. So Hannah turned away from the exit. She told herself she was only going to sit for a minute before driving. She walked past radiology, past the darkened gift shop, past a wall of framed photographs showing donors smiling beneath soft studio lights. At the end of a quieter corridor was the hospital chapel. Hannah had passed it hundreds of times. Sometimes she saw families enter quickly, as if prayer were another emergency room. Sometimes she saw people leave slowly, carrying no visible answer. She had gone inside once during her mother's illness, but only because a chaplain had asked whether she wanted somewhere private to make a phone call. She had not prayed then. She had barely breathed. The chapel door was not locked. It opened with a soft wooden sigh. Inside, the light was low and amber. 6 rows of benches faced a simple wooden cross. A small lamp burned near the front, not bright enough to chase away every shadow, only bright enough to show that the shadows were not empty. The air smelled faintly of old books, furniture polish, and rain carried in on other people's coats. There were no stained glass windows, no choir, no candles arranged for beauty, just a narrow room tucked inside a building full of pain, where people came when words had failed them. Hannah sat in the last row. She placed the cold coffee beside her and leaned forward, elbows on her knees. For a while, she did nothing. She did not close her eyes. She did not fold her hands. She did not know what a sincere posture looked like anymore. She had spent years believing that prayer required a certain inward conditioner, clean and steady faith, some quiet confidence that God was listening. She had none of that. She had fatigue. She had anger. She had the strange guilt of someone who had cared for the dying every week, yet still felt betrayed by one death. "I do not know what to say," she whispered. The words sounded too small for the room. But they were the first honest words she had spoken all night. Nothing moved. The rain continued against the windows. Somewhere beyond the chapel wall, a cart rolled past, its wheels rattling briefly over a seam in the floor. Hannah waited without knowing what she expected. A feeling, perhaps, a thought that did not sound like her own. A sudden warmth, anything that could prove the silence was occupied. But the silence remained silence, and after a minute she almost laughed at herself. She had come into a chapel at 4 in the morning and expected grief to become clear. Then she saw the Bible. It rested on a narrow shelf beneath the bench in front of her. The cover was worn at the corners, the gold lettering nearly rubbed away. Hannah reached for it because doing something felt easier than continuing to sit. When she lifted it, a folded card slipped from between the pages and fell near her shoe. It was only a printed card with the chapel hours on one side and a short prayer on the other. Nothing personal, nothing miraculous. Still, the Bible had opened near the middle, and Hannah's eyes fell on a number written at the top of the page. Psalm 139. Her fingers tightened around the book. Her mother had loved that psalm. Not loudly, not in the way some people display favorite verses on walls or repeat them whenever pain enters a conversation. She had carried it quietly. When Hannah was a child and could not sleep, her mother would sit on the edge of the bed and paraphrase its images. "God knows when you lie down," she would say. "God knows when you wake. He can find you beneath the deepest water. The dark is not dark to him." Hannah had listened beneath a quilt patterned with faded yellow stars, comforted by the thought that God knew the house, the hallway, the small room, and the frightened child inside it. But childhood faith had seemed easier. God had been close because her mother spoke of him as if he were. Years later, when prayers became more desperate and answers less recognizable, the psalm had begun to feel like something written for another kind of person, someone less complicated, someone who could read about being known by God without immediately remembering all the ways she had felt unknown. Hannah looked down at the first line, "You have searched me and known me." Only a few words. She had heard them before, but that night they did not sound gentle at first. They sounded invasive. To be seen is one thing, to be searched is another. Most of us want to be noticed, but we also want control over what is noticed. We choose the photograph. We edit the sentence. We tell the part of the story that makes sense. We want someone to recognize our pain without seeing our resentment, to admire our strength without discovering how close it is to collapse, to affirm our kindness without asking whether some of it is an attempt to earn love. We long to be understood, yet we are afraid of what understanding might uncover. Human beings hide even while begging not to be overlooked. Hannah knew how to do that well. She knew how to tell co-workers she was managing. She knew how to answer, "How are you?" with the exact tone that ended the question. She knew how to speak of her mother with a soft smile that made other people comfortable. She knew how to say Daniel was simply busy, that everyone grieved differently, that she did not expect him to understand what the last months had been like. She had arranged the pieces of her life into an explanation others could accept. But the verse did not say God had accepted her explanation. It said he had searched her. She read the words again, slower this time. "You have searched me," not "you glanced at me," not "you noticed me when I was doing well," not "you remembered me when I became useful." The language reached deeper. It suggested attention without hurry, knowledge without guesswork. It suggested that God did not know only the public rooms of a life. He knew the locked ones. He knew the hallways. He knew where the floorboards creaked. He knew what had been placed in the closet and what had been hidden beneath the bed. Hannah wanted to close the Bible and service. Instead, she turned her thumb against the edge of the page and stared at the wooden cross in front of her. A small part of her felt offended. If God had searched her, if he truly knew her, then he knew what the past year had cost. He knew how many times she had driven to her mother's house before sunrise. He knew the medical forms, the medication schedules, the meals left untouched. He knew the night Daniel promised to come and did not. He knew the final week. He knew the prayer Hannah repeated until the words became dry in her mouth. If he knew, why had she felt so alone? The question rose not as a theological puzzle, but as an old wound. Hannah had heard people explain suffering with tidy sentences. God has a plan. Everything happens for a reason. Heaven needed another angel. The words had been offered kindly, but they had landed like closed doors. They seemed to ask her to stop asking before she had even understood the question. She did not want a slogan. She wanted to know whether God had been in the room when her mother struggled to breathe. She wanted to know whether he had heard the prayer that never became eloquent. She wanted to know whether being known by God changed anything when the person who knew you best was gone.
The chapel remained still.
And yet, the verse did not ask Hannah to solve any of that before reading the next line. It simply stood there, patient and unafraid of her resistance. You have searched me and known me. There is a difference between being watched and being known. To be watched is to be observed from outside. A camera can watch. A stranger can watch. A crowd can watch and still misunderstand everything. But to be known is to be held inside another's understanding. It means the surface is not the whole story. It means the action is seen together with the fear beneath it, the failure together with the wound, the silence together with the words that could not be formed. Psalm 139 does not begin with David proving that he knows God. It begins with the astonishing claim that God knows David. Before worship, before confession, before insight, before obedience, there is divine attention. The foundation of the psalm is not the strength of a human grip on God, it is the steadiness of God's gaze upon a human life. Hannah had spent months trying to maintain her grip of her. She went to work, she paid bills, she answered messages. She kept her mother's plants alive, even though she had never learned their names. She attended church twice after the funeral and sat near the back, leaving before anyone could ask how she was. She continued moving because stopping felt dangerous. She thought faith meant holding everything together while telling God she trusted him. But what if faith began somewhere else? What if it began not with how tightly she could hold, but with the possibility that she was already being held? A soft sound came from the doorway. Hannah turned quickly. An elderly man stood there in a hospital robe beneath a grey cardigan, one hand resting on an IV pole. He looked surprised to see her, as though he had expected the chapel to belong only to him. Hannah straightened automatically, the nurse in her returning before the woman in her could speak. "Are you all right?" she asked. The man smiled faintly. "I was going to ask you the same thing." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he entered and sat in the front row. Hannah recognized him from another unit, but did not know his name. He did not ask her to leave. He did not ask what she was reading. He simply lowered his head, and the room settled around them both. Two strangers, each carrying a private weight, sitting beneath the same quiet light. Hannah looked again at the page. Perhaps this was how God often worked, not by interrupting the world with spectacle, but by placing one honest moment inside another. The old man had seen her face and asked a question no one else had asked all night. It did not solve her grief. It did not prove every doctrine. It was only a small human kindness. But small kindnesses sometimes reveal how starved we have become for recognition. She wondered how many people in the hospital felt invisible at that exact moment. The father sleeping upright beside his daughter's bed. The janitor cleaning a room where a family had just received bad news. The resident doctor blinking back exhaustion in the stairwell. The woman waiting for test results while everyone she loved slept miles away. The man in front of her, praying without sound. So many lives hidden behind doors. So many fears without witnesses. And yet the psalm made a claim large enough to include all of them. God saw the closed room. God saw the silent chair. God saw the person who was always called strong and the person who had stopped believing strength mattered. His attention did not move through the hospital like a spotlight, choosing one life and leaving another in darkness. It was not divided by the number of people who needed him. He did not know Hannah less because he knew the old man too. Divine attention was not scarce. That thought was almost harder to believe than a miracle. Hannah had learned that attention could run out. Her mother's attention had been generous, but illness consumed it. Daniel's attention disappeared into his work, his own fear, and whatever else kept him away. Hannah's attention was given in measured doses to patients because there were always more call lights than hands. Every human form of care had limits. Perhaps she had placed those limits on God without realizing it. Perhaps she imagined him moving through the world, too busy to notice one tired nurse in a chapel before dawn. But Psalm 139 did not describe a hurried God. It described one who searches. Hannah breathed in slowly. The air felt cool in her chest. She placed one palm against the open page, not because the gesture was sacred, but because she needed something steady beneath her hand. Her eyes burned with tears she did not want to release in front of a stranger. She blinked and looked toward the side wall, where rainwater traced shifting shadows across the paint.
"If you know me," she whispered,
so quietly the old man could not hear, "then you know I am angry." The sentence frightened her. She had said she was tired. She had said she was sad. Anger felt different. Anger felt disrespectful, dangerous, too close to accusation. But if the verse was true, then silence had never hidden it. God did not learn about her anger when she named it. He had known it when she smiled through condolences, when she folded her mother's clothes, when she told Daniel she understood, when she stared at the ceiling and refused to pray. The strange thing was that the chapel did not become colder. No light went out. No sense of judgment descended. The old man remained bowed in prayer. The rain continued. Hannah remained seated. The world did not collapse because she had told God what he already knew. For the first time in months, she felt a small opening inside her. Not relief exactly, but room. Room for honesty. Room for a faith that did not require pretending. Room for the possibility that being searched by God was not the same as being exposed before a cruel audience. Perhaps he searched not to find a reason to reject her, but because love refuses to remain at the surface. Human beings often search for evidence against one another. We collect failures, contradictions, forgotten promises. We look closely when trust has already broken. But God's searching in Psalm 139 is joined to knowledge, presence, formation, and guidance. The one who sees the hidden thought is also the one whose hand leads. The one who knows the darkness is also the one for whom darkness cannot overcome light. The search is not conducted by an enemy looking for weakness. It is conducted by the Creator, who knows what every wound has touched. Hannah did not understand all of that yet. She only knew the first line no longer looked like an accusation. It looked like a door. She read the next words. God knew when she sat down. God knew when she rose. He understood thoughts from far away. He was familiar with every path. The language moved from the hidden soul into ordinary movement, as if heaven paid attention not only to great decisions and desperate prayers, but to chairs, footsteps, routines, and roads. Hannah almost smiled. Her whole night had been made of sitting and rising. Sit beside a patient, rise when the call light sounds, sit to enter notes, rise to answer a question, sit in the car, rise because there is another shift, sit in the chapel. Perhaps she had believed God would notice only the dramatic moments, the funeral, the final prayer, the days she succeeded or failed. But the psalm began with the unnoticed rhythm of a body moving through an ordinary day. The old man stood slowly. He steadied himself on the bench, then turned toward the door. As he passed Hannah, he paused. "Sometimes this room is the only place where I do not have to explain myself," he said. Hannah looked at him. "Does that help?" He considered the question. "Not always immediately." His smile was tired but real. "But it helps to remember I am speaking to someone who does not need the explanation." Then he left. The door closed softly behind him, and Hannah was alone again. Yet the room no longer felt empty in the same way. She looked down at Psalm 139 and wondered whether she had misunderstood prayer for most of her life. Perhaps prayer was not the difficult work of making God understand. Perhaps it was the slower work of allowing herself to be understood. Outside, the first hint of morning had not yet reached the sky. The night still held the hospital. Her mother was still gone. Daniel had still not called. Nothing visible had changed, but a sentence had found her in the dark. "You have searched me and known me." Hannah had entered the chapel wanting proof that God had noticed her pain. She had not expected the deeper possibility that He knew not only the pain she could name, but every thought beneath it, every memory attached to it, every fear it had created, and every word she had never dared to say. And as she turned to the next lines, one question began to rise above all the others. What happens when the God you have been asking to notice you reveals that He has never looked away? There are thoughts we would never say aloud, not because they are unimportant, but because they are too important. We carry them beneath polite answers and practiced smiles. We tell people we are tired when we are actually heartbroken. We say we understand when we feel abandoned. We say we have forgiven because we are afraid to admit that the wound still speaks. But Psalm 139 does not stop at the things a person is willing to confess. It moves toward the hidden language beneath the tongue. And on that rainy morning, as Hannah sat alone in the hospital chapel, she began to realize that God had been listening to a prayer she had never known how to pray. The page said that God knew when she sat down and when she rose. He understood her thought before distance, confusion, or silence could obscure it. He knew the word before it reached her tongue. Hannah read the lines slowly, then looked toward the closed door where the elderly patient had disappeared. His final sentence remained with her. He did not have to explain himself here. She had always assumed prayer was explanation. Tell God what happened. Tell Him what you need. Tell Him why it hurts. Use the right words. Mean them enough. Ask with faith. Wait with patience. But what if the one listening already understood what the speaker could not organize? A memory came to her from the week after the funeral. She had been standing in the cereal aisle of a grocery store, staring at two nearly identical boxes. Her mother had preferred one brand, though Hannah could not remember which. The thought should have been small. Instead, it opened something beneath her ribs. She had left the cart beside a shelf, walked quickly to her car, and sat behind the steering wheel without starting the engine. For 20 minutes, she had watched strangers push carts through the rain while tears moved silently down her face. She had not prayed. She had not even formed a sentence. She had only thought, "I cannot do this." At the time, Hannah believed nothing had passed between her and God. No prayer had been spoken, no scripture had been recalled. She had not felt faithful, only defeated. Yet the psalm suggested that the thought had not vanished inside her. It had been known before she could name it. The God described by David was not waiting beyond a locked door for eloquence. He was present at the first trembling movement of the heart. That possibility changed the meaning of many moments Hannah had dismissed as spiritually empty. There had been the morning she stood in her mother's kitchen, unable to decide which dishes to keep. There had been the afternoon she drove past the church because she could not bear to sing. There had been the night she opened a message from Daniel, saw his brief excuse, and placed the phone face down before anger could become words. There had been the countless times she washed her hands at work, staring at the water while a feeling she could not identify moved through her. She had thought prayer began only when she addressed God directly. But perhaps God had been present before the address, before the grammar, before the courage. The thought was comforting until Hannah remembered what else remained unspoken. She looked down at her hands. The skin near her knuckles was dry from sanitizer. A thin white scar crossed her left thumb from a broken glass years earlier. She rubbed it without thinking, as she often did when anxious. If God knew the word before it reached her tongue, then he knew the words she had swallowed because they were cruel. He knew the imaginary arguments she had won in empty rooms. He knew how often she pictured Daniel finally understanding what he had left her to carry. He knew that beneath her sadness lived a demand. Someone should pay for the loneliness I endured. Hannah closed her eyes. She could see Daniel at their mother's funeral, standing near the doorway in a dark suit that did not fit well. He had looked pale and exhausted. People had embraced him as though he had been present for every appointment and every long night. They had told him what a good son he was. Hannah had watched from across the room, holding a plate she never ate from, and felt something harden inside her. Later, when he hugged her, he whispered, "I am sorry you had to handle so much." She had answered, "It is all right." It was not all right. The sentence had been one of the cleanest lies she had ever told. It sounded generous. It protected the moment. It allowed other people to keep grieving without interruption. It also buried the truth where resentment could feed on it in darkness. Most hidden things do not disappear. They change shape. Unspoken grief can become numbness. Unspoken fear can become control. Unspoken disappointment can become cynicism. Unspoken anger can become a distance so familiar that we call it peace. We often imagine silence as the absence of conflict, but sometimes silence is where conflict learns to live without being challenged. Hannah had not shouted at Daniel. She had not accused him. She had answered his occasional messages politely, yet inside her, a courtroom met almost every night. She presented evidence, she replayed promises, she imagined his defense and rejected it before he spoke. Psalm 139 entered that courtroom without taking sides, in the way Hannah expected. It did not deny what Daniel had failed to do. It did not excuse absence. It did not tell her that pain was imaginary. It simply revealed that God knew the entire case, including the parts Hannah had hidden from herself. This is one reason being fully known can feel frightening. We want God to know the facts that prove we were wounded. We are less eager for him to know what the wound has begun creating within us. We want him to see the nights we cried, but not always the pleasure we take in rehearsing another person's guilt. We want him to understand why we built the wall, but not ask whether the wall has become a prison. Yet divine knowledge is too loving to stop where our preferred story stops. Hannah opened her eyes and read the next line again. Before a word was on her tongue, God knew it completely. Completely, not partially, not merely the vocabulary. He knew the history inside the word. He knew the childhood memory attached to it, the fatigue that sharpened it, the fear beneath it, the love still buried under the anger. When Hannah thought, "Daniel left me," God knew the nights that made the sentence true. He also knew Daniel's fear, his avoidance, his shame, and whatever story Hannah could not see. Complete knowledge belonged only to God. Every human judgment, including hers, was made with missing pages. That did not make her pain less real. It made humility possible. A soft knock sounded against the chapel door, though no one waited for an answer. A young orderly entered carrying a stack of folded linens. He glanced at Hannah, apologized, and moved toward a small cabinet near the wall. His name tag read Miguel. He placed the linens inside with careful movements, then noticed the cold coffee beside her. "That cannot be good anymore," he said. Hannah looked at the cup. "It gave up a long time ago," Miguel smiled. "There is fresh coffee near the emergency desk. Not good coffee, but a live coffee." She laughed before she could stop herself. The sound surprised her. It was small and rough from disuse, but it belonged to her. Miguel nodded as if his work were complete, closed the cabinet, and left. For a few seconds, Hannah stared at the door. The moment was ordinary to the point of insignificance. yet something about it touched her. Miguel had not known her story. He had not offered wisdom. He had noticed a cold cup and made a joke. It was the kind of detail Hannah usually noticed for others. Receiving that small attention felt almost uncomfortable. Perhaps God often reached people through moments too ordinary to be called miracles. A worn cup, a chair pulled closer, a message sent at the right hour, a stranger who asks twice when the first answer is obviously false. We look for thunder because thunder seems worthy of heaven, while grace sometimes arrives wearing a name tag and carrying hospital linens. Hannah rose and walked to the emergency desk. The corridors had begun to change. Night staff moved with the tired relief of people nearing the end of their shift. A maintenance worker polished the floor in wide circles. Behind a glass wall, 2 doctors spoke over a chart. In a waiting area, a teenage boy slept with his head on his father's shoulder. Hannah poured coffee into a clean cup and felt the heat through the paper. She added no sugar. Her mother had always said coffee should be allowed to tell the truth. The memory brought a sudden ache, but not the crushing kind. This one was almost tender. On her way back to the chapel, Hannah passed room 314. The door was slightly open. Inside, Mrs. Callahan, one of Hannah's patients from earlier in the night, lay awake beneath a white blanket. Her daughter slept in the chair beside her. Mrs. Callahan saw Hannah in the hallway and lifted 2 fingers in a weak wave. Hannah stepped inside. "You should be resting." "I have been trying," the woman whispered. "My mind is louder than the machines." Hannah checked the monitor, adjusted the blanket, and asked whether she was in pain. Mrs. Callahan shook her head. "I am thinking about all the things I did not tell my children," she said. "You think you have time for the important words? Then one day people are speaking quietly around your bed, and you begin to wonder what they already know." Hannah glanced at the sleeping daughter. "You can tell them when she wakes." Mrs. Callahan's eyes filled. "What if I say it wrong?" The question entered Hannah like a key. "You do not have to say it perfectly," she answered. "You only have to say what is true." Mrs. Callahan studied her face, and for a moment, Hannah had the uncomfortable feeling that she had spoken to herself. The older woman reached for her hand. "That sounds like something you learned the hard way." Hannah looked toward the window. Rain blurred the lights outside. "Maybe I am still learning it." She remained until Mrs. Callahan's breathing slowed, then returned to the chapel with fresh coffee and the woman's question following her. "What if I say it wrong?" How many prayers never begin because someone fears saying them wrong? How many apologies remain unsent because the first sentence cannot carry the whole truth? How many people wait for a cleaner heart before coming to God, as though honesty must be polished before it can be received? Psalm 139 removes that fear at its root. God knows the word completely before we say it incompletely. This does not make words unnecessary. Love still speaks, confession still names, prayer still reaches. But words are no longer a performance designed to make God understand. They become an act of trust. We speak not to inform Him, but to open the places He already knows. We allow truth to move from the hidden room into the light, where grace can meet it. Hannah sat again and held the coffee between both hands. The warmth moved into her fingers. She tried to pray about Daniel. "God, I am angry with him." She stopped. The sentence fell flat, too simple for years of memory. She tried again. "I am angry that he was not there. I am angry that I had to make decisions alone. I am angry that people think we carried the same loss in the same way. I am angry that I still want him to call." That last sentence broke something open. She still wanted him to call. Beneath the resentment was not only a demand for justice, there was longing. She wanted her brother back. She wanted someone who remembered the same kitchen, the same Christmas mornings, the same sound of their mother's laugh before illness made it rare. She wanted Daniel to ask what the final night had been like, then stay long enough to hear the answer. Anger had protected that longing by making it feel unnecessary. God knew both. He knew the accusation and the ache. He knew Hannah wanted distance and reunion at the same time. He knew she feared forgiveness because she confused it with pretending. He knew she feared confrontation because Daniel might confirm the worst thing she believed, that her pain did not matter to him. Every contradiction was already visible. She did not have to become emotionally simple before she could be loved. That truth reached beyond Hannah's story. Many people believe God loves the version of them that makes sense. The faithful version, the grateful version, the version that forgives quickly, prays clearly, and never wakes at 2 in the morning angry about something that happened 10 years ago. But Psalm 139 is not addressed to a simplified human being. It is a song from a complicated heart to a God whose knowledge is complete. Complete knowledge is what makes complete love meaningful. To be loved by someone who knows only your best moments is beautiful, but fragile. You wonder what will happen when the hidden thing is discovered. You manage the image, you keep certain doors closed, but if God knows the thought before the word, the motive beneath the action, the fear beneath the motive, and still draws near, then his love is not waiting for a future revelation. There is no moment when he suddenly learns the truth about you and regrets his mercy. Hannah had heard people say God knew everything. The statement had sounded like doctrine, distant and polished. In the chapel, it became personal. God knew why she took extra shifts. He knew it was partly generosity and partly escape. He knew why she kept her mother's scarf on the chair. He knew she was afraid that moving it would make the apartment officially hers alone. He knew why she had not answered Daniel's last message. He knew she wanted him to feel the silence he had given her. He knew the exact second she began to believe she was easier to need than to love. And he had not left the room. A pale ambulance light swept briefly across the chapel wall as a vehicle turned outside. The red reflection passed over the wooden cross and vanished. Hannah watched the room return to amber. She thought of all the moments in life that disappear that quickly. A look across a table, a hand on a shoulder, a sentence we almost say, a chance to ask one more question. Human memory keeps some and loses others. But the psalm described a God familiar with every path. Familiar, not merely aware. The word suggested presence, repeated over time. God knew the route Hannah drove to work, including the intersection where she always looked toward her mother's old neighborhood. He knew the 5 steps from her bed to the window. He knew the corridor between room 314 and the chapel. He knew the path her mind took from fatigue to fear, from fear to control, from control to isolation. He knew the roads she chose and the roads she avoided. Hannah wondered whether God had been familiar with her life even during the years she felt far from him. Perhaps distance did not confuse him. Perhaps the roads that felt like wandering to her were still visible from heaven. She thought of David's words, moving toward an even larger question. Where could a person go from God's Spirit? Where could anyone flee from his presence? The verse had once sounded triumphant. That morning, it sounded dangerous. Because Hannah had been fleeing. Not across borders, not into rebellion anyone else would recognize. She had been fleeing through usefulness. Every extra shift gave her one more night away from the apartment. Every patient who needed her gave her permission to postpone her own need. Every act of service became another door she could close between herself and silence. She had called it responsibility. Some of it was, but God knew the whole truth. What do you call a hiding place that looks like faithfulness? Hannah stared at the open Bible. The answer did not come, but the question remained. It moved through her memories and touched places she had carefully labeled harmless. her exhaustion, her constant availability, her refusal to receive help, her habit of changing the subject when anyone came close. She had not run from God by saying he did not exist. She had run by making sure she was never still enough to discover whether he was near. The hospital clock in the corridor clicked to 4:37. Dawn was still some distance away. Hannah's shift had ended, but she felt as though another kind of night had only begun. She read the lines again. God knew her sitting, her rising, her thoughts, her paths, her words. The psalm did not leave a single ordinary movement outside his attention. There was no invisible version of Hannah hidden behind the useful one. There was only one woman fully seen. She lifted the coffee and took a slow drink. It was not good coffee. Miguel had been honest, but it was warm. "You know what I cannot say," she whispered. "Then help me stop hiding inside what I can do." The prayer was imperfect. It was also true, and somewhere beneath her anger, beneath her fatigue, beneath the habits that had kept her moving, Hannah felt the faintest awareness of being met. Not fixed, not answered in every mystery, met. Yet Psalm 139 was about to move beyond the chapel, beyond the hospital, beyond every familiar road. It would imagine heaven, the depths, the far side of the sea, and the darkest place a person could enter. Hannah had asked whether God knew her unspoken thoughts. The next question was larger. If she ran as far as grief could carry her, would he still be there when she arrived? Some people run from God by crossing oceans. Others run without leaving the room. They keep the television on. They volunteer for one more task. They answer messages at midnight. They fill every silence before silence can ask a question. From the outside, their lives look responsible, generous, even faithful, but inwardly they are moving as fast as they can away from the place where pain is waiting. Hannah had never thought of herself as someone who ran from God. She had simply become very good at never being still. In the chapel, the words of Psalm 139 opened wider. David imagined the highest heaven and the deepest place. He imagined traveling with the first rays of dawn and settling beyond the farthest sea. The images crossed every boundary known to an ancient traveler: height, depth, distance, darkness. Yet each imagined escape ended the same way. God was already there. His hand still guided, his presence arrived before the fugitive. Hannah looked toward the narrow window near the ceiling. Rainwater made the outside lights bend and blur. She tried to picture the first light of morning racing across the world while the city still slept. Somewhere east of the hospital, beyond rows of apartments and bridges and dark fields, the horizon would eventually turn grey, then silver, then pale gold. David wrote as though a person could take hold of that light and ride it to the edge of everything. Even there, he said, God would not be absent. The thought should have sounded comforting. Instead, it exposed her. Hannah had filled the months after her mother's death with motion. At first, everyone praised her for it. She returned to work earlier than expected. She answered thank you cards. She organized paperwork. She donated medical equipment. She packed clothes into labeled boxes and drove them to a shelter. People told her she was strong. Each compliment became another reason not to stop. Strength was useful because it kept other people from looking too closely. It also kept Hannah from looking closely at herself. There is a kind of busyness that serves love, and there is a kind that protects us from love. The two can appear identical. Both may cook meals, answer calls, stay late, and carry burdens. But one flows from freedom, while the other is terrified of what will happen when the work is done. God alone sees the difference completely. He knows when service is an offering and when it has become an escape route. Hannah thought of the extra night shifts she had accepted. She told her supervisor she needed the overtime. That was partly true. Funeral expenses had been higher than expected. But money was not the whole reason. Night shifts spared her from evenings at home. They gave her a place where alarms interrupted memory and where other people's emergencies were louder than her own. In the hospital, she was necessary. In the apartment, she was simply bereaved. Necessary felt safer. The psalm asked where she could go from God's Spirit. Hannah almost answered, "I know many places. The medication room at 2A, the supermarket aisle, the car beneath the parking garage, the back row of a church where music filled every space but the one inside her, her mother's empty kitchen, the shower where running water hid the sound of crying." She had occupied all those places and felt no divine presence. If God had been there, he had been quieter than grief. But perhaps feeling alone and being alone were not the same thing. That distinction can sound cruel when offered too quickly. People in pain do not need someone to dismiss what they felt. The night is dark even when dawn exists. The wound hurts even when healing is possible. Faith does not require a person to rename loneliness as comfort. Psalm 139 does something gentler. It allows the darkness to remain darkness from the human point of view, then declares that darkness cannot make a person invisible to God. Hannah traced the margin of the page. She remembered the night her mother died. It had begun with small changes. A different tone in the doctor's voice. A nurse checking the monitor more often. The way people entered the room softly, carrying less equipment than before. Hannah understood what was happening long before anyone said it plainly. Her mother, Ruth, had been asleep most of the afternoon. Near evening, she opened her eyes and asked whether it was raining. It was not. The sky outside was clear and colorless. "No," Hannah said, "not tonight." Ruth smiled faintly. It sounded like rain. Hannah adjusted the blanket. She wanted to ask whether her mother was afraid. She wanted to say that she was afraid. Instead, she offered ice chips and checked the clock. Clinical habits gave her hands something to do. Daughter and nurse lived inside the same body, and the nurse kept protecting the daughter from collapsing. Daniel had promised to come to. At 6, he texted that traffic was bad. At 7, he said he was still trying. At 8, the doctor asked Hannah whether there were other family members who needed to be called. She called Daniel twice. The first call rang until voicemail. The second was declined. At 8:43, Ruth woke again. Her breathing had become uneven. Hannah sat beside her and took her hand. The room was dim except for the light above the sink. In the hallway, someone laughed, then immediately lowered their voice. A cart squeaked past. Life continued with shocking indifference. Hannah had tried to pray. She began with words she had heard all her life. "Lord, please." Then nothing followed. She could not ask for healing with confidence. She could not ask for release without feeling disloyal. She could not say, "Your will be done," because the phrase felt too large and too clean for what was happening. So she held her mother's hand and repeated one word silently. "Please, please, please." Ruth's fingers moved once around hers. Then, after a long hour in which time seemed to lose all measurement, the room became still. Hannah had always imagined that when death came, something spiritual would be unmistakable. A peace, a presence, a sense that heaven had drawn near. Instead, she heard the air system. She heard the click of the clock. She heard her own breath arrive in a broken sound she did not recognize. The nurse entered, touched Hannah's shoulder, and began the gentle work that follows a final moment. God did not feel present. For months, That absence had become evidence in Hannah's mind. She had asked him to come, and she had felt nothing. She had needed a hand stronger than her own, and the room had seemed empty. Whenever people spoke of God being near the broken-hearted, Hannah remembered the hum of fluorescent lights and wondered why nearness had felt exactly like abandonment. Now, in the chapel, David's words stood against that memory. Even there, not only in sanctuaries, not only in moments of emotional certainty, even there, in the hospital room, in the second after the monitor changed, in the silence following the last breath, in the parking lot where Daniel arrived 40 minutes too late and leaned against his car with both hands over his face. Even there. Hannah resisted the thought. She did not want to rewrite the night into something beautiful. It had not been beautiful. It had been painful, lonely, and unfinished. Faith that beautifies suffering too quickly can become another way of refusing to see it. But the psalm did not say the depths were pleasant. It said the depths were not beyond God. There is a difference. God's presence does not always announce itself by removing pain. Sometimes it is known only afterward, through the strength that appeared when no strength remained. Sometimes it is the person who stayed. Sometimes it is the unexplained ability to take one more breath. Sometimes it is a mercy so small that grief overlooks it at first. Hannah began to remember details from that final night she had not considered in months. The nurse who entered after Ruth died was named Lila. She had knelt beside Hannah instead of standing over her. She did not say, "She's in a better place." She did not tell Hannah to be strong. She simply rested one hand on the edge of the bed and said, "You do not have to leave until you are ready." Then she turned off the harsh light above the sink and brought a small lamp from the hall. Later, a custodian named Mr. Owens placed a cup of water beside Hannah without speaking. She had seen him hundreds of times since then, but never told him she remembered. The hospital chaplain came to the doorway. Hannah shook her head before he could enter. He nodded and said, "I will be nearby." He did not force prayer into the room. He respected the boundary and remained close. Daniel finally arrived, soaked with sweat from running across the parking lot. Though the night was cold, he stood at the foot of the bed, unable to look at Ruth's face. Hannah had remembered only his lateness. Now she remembered his knees giving way against the chair. She remembered that he whispered, "I was afraid to come because I knew this would be real." His absence had wounded her. His fear had also been real. None of these details turned loss into a lesson, but together they suggested that the room had not been as empty as Hannah remembered. Presence had come quietly, a nurse kneeling, a light softened, water set beside her, a chaplain waiting outside, a frightened brother collapsing at last. None of them were God, yet each had carried something of compassion into the darkness. What if Hannah had been looking for God only in the form of rescue, and therefore missed him in the form of companionship? The question did not answer why Ruth died. It did not explain why Daniel was late. It did not erase the ache, but it loosened the certainty that God had abandoned her. Perhaps the deepest night of her life contained not proof of his absence, but a different kind of evidence, quieter, humbler, harder to recognize while grief was shouting. David's image grew darker still. Even if darkness covered him, even if light became night, darkness would not be dark to God. The words did not say David could see clearly. They said God could. That mattered. A child lost in a dark room does not need to see the parent in order to be seen by the parent. The child's fear is real. The parent's vision is also real. Hannah had been trying to make herself see. She wanted to understand God's purpose, trace his plan, identify the exact good that would justify what happened. When she could not, she concluded there was no light. But Psalm 139 did not demand that she possess God's vision. It asked her to trust that her blindness did not become His. For the first time, Hannah considered that faith in darkness might be less about finding an explanation and more about allowing oneself to be found. A siren approached the hospital, growing louder as it entered the emergency drive. Red light flashed through the high chapel window. Hannah heard doors open, wheels move quickly, voices become precise. Somewhere, another family was about to enter a night they had not chosen. She felt the old reflex to stand and help, though her shift had ended. She remained seated. Remaining felt like an act of courage. She let the siren pass through her without following it. She let herself remember Ruth's room. She let the grief rise without immediately converting it into work. Tears gathered and slipped down her face. Hannah did not wipe them away. No one was there to be reassured by her composure. "I thought you left me," she said. The sentence hung in the chapel. "I thought I was holding her hand alone." Her shoulders shook once. Then again, the tears came without drama, quiet and steady. They had been waiting behind months of useful movement. Hannah leaned forward and pressed her palms together, not in a graceful posture of prayer, but because her hands needed somewhere to go. "Were you there?" No audible answer came. Instead, the memory of Lila kneeling returned with unusual clarity. "You do not have to leave until you are ready." Hannah breathed in sharply. She could not prove that God had arranged the sentence. She did not need to. It revealed something true regardless. She had not been rushed through the most sacred grief of her life. Someone had made room, someone had stayed, and perhaps God had been present in the staying. We often expect divine presence to feel powerful. Sometimes it feels like permission to fall apart safely. Sometimes it is not the hand that prevents the loss, but the hand that refuses to release us after the loss has happened. David wrote, "Even there, your hand will guide me. Not only here, where faith is clear, even there, in the place I feared, in the consequence I did not choose, in the country of grief where I do not know the language, even there, a hand remains." Hannah pictured herself after the funeral, moving through weeks she barely remembered. Meals had appeared outside her door. Mrs. Patel from the apartment downstairs watered Ruth's plants while Hannah worked. Her supervisor quietly changed a schedule so she would not be assigned to the room where her mother died. A friend named Claire sent messages every Sunday for 2 months, even when Hannah did not answer. Hannah had called those things kindness. Perhaps kindness was one of the ways God's hand had reached her without demanding recognition. The realization was not dramatic. It did not flood her with certainty. It arrived like morning light under a door, thin, quiet, undeniable once noticed. God had not been absent simply because she had been unable to feel Him. That sentence carried a tenderness Hannah had not expected. Feelings are real, but they are not always final witnesses. Exhaustion can testify that there is no hope. Shame can testify that there is no mercy. Grief can testify that there is no presence. Their testimony matters because it tells the truth about our experience. But Psalm 139 introduces another witness, the God who sees in darkness. Hannah lifted her head. The chapel looked the same. The lamp near the cross still burned. Her coffee had cooled slightly. Rain continued, though more softly now. Yet the room no longer seemed sealed off from the rest of her life. It had become connected to the hospital room, the grocery store, the empty apartment, the parking lot, every place she had marked God absent. Where could she go from His Spirit? She thought of the answer David gave through image after image, upward, downward, eastward, westward. No direction led beyond God. Even flight itself happened inside His awareness. A person could run from prayer, from church, from memory, from people who used religious words carelessly. A person could run from every place associated with faith, but no one could run into a place where God stopped seeing. For some, that idea sounds threatening. For Hannah, it slowly became relief. She was tired of keeping track of herself, tired of proving she was still functioning, tired of watching for the moment grief might overtake her. If God's presence was inescapable, then perhaps she could stop maintaining the illusion that everything depended on her ability to remain steady. A line from childhood returned. Her mother had whispered it during thunderstorms. The dark is not dark to him. Hannah remembered lying beneath the yellow star quilt, watching lightning illuminate the room. She had believed her mother's presence kept her safe. Now she understood that Ruth had been teaching something larger. Parents leave rooms. Bodies fail. Human hands eventually release the hands they love. But the psalm pointed toward a presence that did not depend on breath, distance, strength, or time. Hannah placed her hand over the silver necklace at her throat. The pendant was a small circle engraved with a single word: held. Ruth had given it to her on her 35th birthday. For the days you forget, her mother had said. Hannah had assumed she meant held by family, held by love, held by memory. Maybe Ruth meant all of it. Maybe she meant something deeper than she knew how to explain. The rain weakened to a whisper. Hannah turned the page slightly and saw the psalm move from the farthest reaches of creation into the hidden beginning of a human life. The language changed. Heaven and sea gave way to the secret place, to formation, to the mysterious work by which a person exists before anyone else can see them. Before Hannah could ask why God had allowed the day that broke her heart, the psalm asked her to remember an earlier day, a day before her first memory, before her first achievement, before anyone called her strong. The question reached beneath grief, because grief often convinces us that the worst thing that happened has become the truest thing about us. Hannah had begun to define herself by the year of loss, the daughter who stayed, the sister who was left alone, the nurse who could not save the person she loved most. But her story had not begun in a hospital room. It had begun in a hidden place, before duty, before disappointment, before she learned to earn affection by being useful. There is a mercy in being led that far back. Human beings remember us from the moment they meet us. They know the chapter in which they entered. Even parents know only what can be seen, felt, imagined, or hoped for. But David described a God whose knowledge reached into the secret beginning, when personality had not yet become performance and worth had not yet been attached to achievement. Hannah rested her fingertips on the next lines. She thought of all the labels placed on a life after it begins: easy child, difficult child, gifted, average, beautiful, awkward, successful, disappointing, chosen, overlooked. Some labels are spoken, others are learned from silence. We carry them so long that they begin to sound like our own names. But what did God call a person before the world had language for them? A day existed before Hannah's first memory, before her first achievement, before anyone called her strong. A day when no human eye had seen her at all. And God had, before the world gives us a name, it gives us expectations. Be easy to love, be useful, be beautiful in the approved way, be successful quickly enough that no one worries about you, be strong, but not inconveniently honest, be kind, but never needy. Most of us begin learning these rules before we can explain them. We discover which version of ourselves receives warmth and which version makes a room uncomfortable. Then, little by little, we build a life around being welcomed. But Psalm 139 reaches back to a place before performance. before comparison, before anyone had the power to applaud or reject you. It says that in the hidden beginning, God was already present. Hannah read the lines about being formed in the secret place. David did not describe himself as a machine assembled at a distance. He used the language of careful work, of inward parts shaped where no human eye could watch. The image was intimate and mysterious. A life unseen by the world was not unseen by God. Before a face could be recognized, before a voice could be heard, before a single task could be completed, there was knowledge, there was attention, there was worth. The chapel seemed quieter than before. The storm had moved farther away, leaving only the steady tapping of water from a gutter outside. Hannah leaned back against the bench and closed her eyes. A memory surfaced, one she had not visited in years. She was 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table while Ruth sorted photographs into a large brown envelope. The table was covered with images from birthdays, holidays, school plays, and ordinary afternoons. In one picture, Daniel was asleep in a laundry basket. In another, Hannah stood beneath a garden hose with both arms raised, laughing into the summer sun. Ruth handed her a faded photograph of herself as a young woman, one hand resting on the curve of her stomach. "That was you?" Ruth said. Hannah had studied the photograph with suspicion. "You cannot see me." "No," her mother answered, "but you were there. How did you know it was me?" Ruth smiled. "I did not know everything about you. I did not know what your voice would sound like or what would make you laugh, but I knew you were mine to love." At 8 years old, Hannah had accepted the answer easily. Children can receive mystery before adults teach them to fear it. She placed the photograph beside one of herself in a school uniform and seemed satisfied that both images showed the same person. Years later, she understood how incomplete her mother's knowledge had been. Ruth did not know Hannah would become a nurse. She did not know the arguments they would have, the doors that would be slammed, the apologies that would follow. She did not know she would one day become the patient and Hannah the caregiver. Human love had welcomed a person it could not yet fully see. Psalm 139 claimed that God's knowledge went further. The hidden life was not a blank to him. The secret place was not beyond his sight. He knew without needing to predict. He saw without waiting for evidence. He loved before usefulness could be measured. Hannah opened her eyes. For most of her adult life, she had believed her value came from what she could provide. The belief had not been taught in a single sentence. No one had sat her down and said, "You are lovable only when needed." It had developed through 1,000 small experiences. As a child, Hannah was praised for being no trouble. Daniel was loud, impulsive, and often frightened by change. When their father left, Ruth worked 2 jobs for several years. Hannah learned to make breakfast, pack lunches, and keep Daniel quiet while their mother slept after late shifts. Adults called her mature. They admired how little she asked for. Every compliment carried the same hidden instruction: continue needing nothing. She became excellent at it. At school, Hannah helped classmates and never raised her hand when she was confused. At church, she volunteered to stack chairs while other teenagers talked. In nursing school, she took detailed notes and shared them freely, though she rarely admitted when she was overwhelmed. In relationships, she anticipated needs before they were spoken. People described her as generous, steady, low maintenance. The words sounded like love. Sometimes they were, but they also built a cage. The cage said that belonging had to be maintained. If Hannah became tired, disappointed, uncertain, or angry, she feared she would become difficult. If she asked for help, someone might discover she was not as strong as expected. If she stopped giving, perhaps there would be no reason to stay. This is how performance becomes identity. At first, we do things to receive love. Eventually, we cannot imagine who we are without doing them. The psalm offered a different beginning. Before Hannah packed a lunch, calmed a patient, paid a bill, or kept a promise, God knew her. Before she learned to hide tears in bathrooms and cars, He knew her. Before she had language for faith, doubt, grief, or duty, He knew her. Her life did not become meaningful when it became useful. Usefulness was one expression of a worth that already existed. That distinction is easy to say and difficult to live. The world rewards usefulness because usefulness can be measured. A nurse completes a shift. A parent provides a meal. A worker meets a goal. A friend answers a call. These things matter. Love often becomes visible through them. But when worth and usefulness become the same, rest feels like failure. Illness feels like shame. Aging feels like disappearance. Receiving feels selfish. People begin to believe they are only as valuable as the burden they can carry. Hannah thought of Mrs. Callahan in room 314, lying beneath a blanket and worrying about words left unsaid. The woman's body could no longer do what it once had, yet nothing about her dependence made her less human. Hannah knew this instinctively when caring for patients. She treated the confused, the unconscious, the frail, and the dying with dignity, because their value did not disappear when their abilities did. Why was she unable to offer herself the same mercy? The question settled sharply. Hannah had seen dignity in bodies that could not perform. She had defended it in meetings, protected it in crowded rooms, and spoken gently when patients felt embarrassed. Yet she judged her own worth by productivity with almost mathematical precision. A good day was a day she completed enough. A bad day was a day she needed too much. She believed in grace for everyone except the woman whose face met hers in the mirror. The God of Psalm 139 did not wait at the end of a completed list. He was present at the beginning, when there was no list at all. A faint sound moved through the corridor outside the chapel. At first, Hannah thought it was another cart. Then she heard it again, the brief, unmistakable cry of a newborn somewhere in the maternity wing. The sound was distant, softened by walls, but it entered the chapel with surprising clarity. One small voice announced itself to a building filled with illness, uncertainty, and loss. Hannah listened. The child had done nothing. It had not earned affection, demonstrated talent, or proved good intentions. It could only breathe, cry, receive warmth, and be held. Yet somewhere nearby, people were bending close to count fingers, study a face, and whisper a name. Human love, at its healthiest, begins not with achievement but with wonder. Perhaps this was why David responded to God's formation with awe, not pride, not self-worship, wonder. He looked at the mystery of his own existence and recognized craftsmanship. To say that a life is wonderfully made is not to say every feature matches cultural ideals or every body escapes illness. It is to say that human existence carries a dignity deeper than comparison. Hannah had struggled with comparison in quieter ways than most people knew. She compared her unmarried life to friends who posted family photographs. She compared her small apartment to Daniel's house outside the city. She compared her tired face to younger nurses who seemed to recover from night shifts with ease. She compared her faith to people who spoke of God with effortless certainty. Each comparison reduced a complex life to a single visible measure. God did not know her comparatively. He did not understand Hannah by placing her beside someone else. He did not need another person's beauty to define hers, another person's calling to validate hers, another person's progress to judge hers. Divine knowledge was personal. The psalm did not say God formed humanity in general and then lost track of individuals. David spoke in the first person. You formed me. You saw me. Your thoughts toward me cannot be counted.
There is a holy particularity in that language, Dan. It refuses to let a person disappear into a crowd, Dan. Hannah imagined the hospital from above. Hundreds of rooms, thousands of lights, names printed on wristbands, charts filled with numbers. In medicine, identity had to be verified repeatedly. Name, date of birth, patient number, allergy status. The system protected people by distinguishing one body from another. Yet even the most careful chart held only fragments. It recorded temperature, medication, diagnosis, procedures. It could not record the memory that made someone smile, the regret that kept them awake, the person they still hoped would walk through the door. God's knowledge was not a chart. He knew the measurable and the immeasurable. He knew the cells beneath the skin and the story carried in the heart. He knew the body before the body could be named and the soul before the soul could speak. No hospital band, social category, family role, success, failure, or diagnosis could contain the whole person. Hannah thought of her mother during the final months of illness had changed Ruth's appearance. She lost weight. Her voice weakened. Visitors sometimes spoke to Hannah instead of speaking directly to her, as if a frail body had made the woman inside less present. Ruth hated that. One afternoon, after a doctor discussed her condition without meeting her eyes, she waited until he left and whispered, "I am still in here." Hannah had taken her hand and answered, "I know." Now the memory broke her heart in a new way. I am still in here. It was the plea beneath so many human lives. See more than what has happened to me. See more than what I can no longer do. See more than my diagnosis, my age, my mistake, my reputation, my worst season. See the person beneath the visible condition. Psalm 139 answered that plea before it was spoken. God saw the inward parts along her. He did not confuse Ruth with her illness, Alama. He did not confuse Hannah with her usefulness, Alama. He did not confuse Daniel with his absence, Alama. Complete knowledge allowed no human being to be reduced to one chapter. That truth did not remove responsibility. A person could be fully seen and still need to change. Daniel's fear did not erase the pain he caused. Hannah's grief did not make her resentment harmless. Grace is not denial, but grace begins by seeing the whole person. Because transformation built on contempt only teaches people to hide more skillfully. Hannah wondered how differently she might live if she believed God looked at her with complete truth and complete mercy at once. Would she rest before collapse forced her to? Would she ask for help without offering an apology for existing? Would she stop treating every mistake as evidence that love had been misplaced? Would she allow herself to enjoy something that served no productive purpose? Would she speak honestly to Daniel instead of waiting for him to guess what she needed? The questions felt almost threatening. A life built around earning worth does not surrender the system easily. Performance gives the illusion of control. If love can be earned, then perhaps abandonment can be prevented by trying harder. But if love is a gift, control disappears. The heart must receive what it cannot secure. Receiving had always been harder for Hannah than giving. She remembered her 35th birthday. Ruth had taken her to a small restaurant near the river. At the end of the meal, she gave Hannah the silver necklace engraved with "Held." Hannah had protested that it was too expensive. Ruth looked offended. "Why do you always argue when someone loves you?" she asked. Hannah laughed at the time. "I do not." "You do," Ruth said. "You turn every gift into a debt." The sentence had stayed with her because it was true. Hannah repaid favors quickly. She brought larger gifts than she received. She volunteered after someone helped her. Gratitude was good, but hers often carried fear. She did not want to owe anyone tenderness. Debt could be calculated. Love could not. Now, reading Psalm 139, she realized she had treated God the same way. She received mercy and immediately tried to become worthy of it. She prayed for help and promised to do better. She interpreted blessing as responsibility to perform. She turned grace into an account she could balance. But what could a hidden, unformed life offer in return for being seen? Nothing. That was the point. God's first knowledge of Hannah was not a response to her contribution. She existed within his awareness before she could give, obey, understand, or believe. This did not make obedience meaningless. It gave obedience a healthier root. Love could become a response rather than a purchase. Hannah lowered her head and allowed the thought to move slowly through her. She did not need to become less caring. She did not need to stop serving. Her work mattered. The danger was not usefulness itself. The danger was asking usefulness to answer a question only love could answer. Am I worth staying for? The Psalm's answer came from before her first day. Yes. Not because everyone stayed. They did not. Not because everyone recognized her value. They did not. Not because her life unfolded without rejection. It had not. The answer was yes because the Creator's attention preceded every human verdict. Before the world called her mature, God knew the child who needed comfort. Before the world called her strong, God knew the woman who would sometimes tremble. Before Patience called her nurse, Ruth called her daughter. Before Ruth could call her anything, God saw her in secret. Hannah touched the engraved circle at her throat again. Held. She pictured her mother in the old photograph, young and uncertain, one hand resting over a life she could not see. Ruth's love had been real, but it had also been limited by time. She could carry Hannah only for a season. She could guide her only through part of the story. The grief Hannah felt was proof that human love is both magnificent and mortal. Psalm 139 did not ask her to love Ruth less. It invited her to see that even her mother's gaze had not been the first. God saw Hannah before Ruth did. God knew Hannah before Ruth knew which name she would choose. God's presence surrounded the beginning no photograph could capture. The realization brought tears. But they were different from the tears of part 3. Those had released pain. These carried a quiet tenderness, almost gratitude. Hannah had thought her deepest identity was daughter, nurse, caretaker, grieving sister. All were true. None were first. Known was first. The word settled beneath every other name. Known before useful, known before wounded, known before faithful, known before afraid. Outside the chapel, the newborn cried once more, then became quiet, perhaps gathered into someone's arms. Hannah imagined the child sleeping without understanding anything about the world it had entered. It did not understand danger, duty, achievement, or shame. It simply received warmth. Could faith sometimes look like that? Not ignorance, not passivity, but the willingness to be held before understanding how to repay the hands. Hannah looked again at the psalm. David spoke of days written or known before one of them came to be. The line had once comforted her. After Ruth's death, it troubled her. If God knew the beginning, he also knew the ending. If he saw Hannah before anyone else did, he had seen the hospital room before Hannah entered it. He had known the day Daniel would fail to arrive in time. He had known the hour grief would divide her life into before and after. Tenderness gave way to tension. There are truths that comfort us until suffering asks a second question. God formed me can feel warm. God knew my days can feel frightening. We wonder whether foreknowledge makes pain inevitable, whether divine awareness means divine indifference, whether the one who saw the road should have closed it before we reached the place of loss. These are not faithless questions. They rise precisely because faith believes God was near enough to know. Hannah thought of the language people had used after Ruth died. They spoke as though God's plan were a diagram they could read from a distance. But Hannah had stood inside the event. She knew suffering was not a clean line on a page. It was a room, a smell, a timestamp, an empty coat hook, a phone that did not ring. Any answer that ignored those details felt too small. Perhaps the psalm was not offering a diagram. Perhaps it was offering a witness. Before Hannah tried to understand what the known days meant, she needed to ask what kind of God was doing the knowing. Was he a distant observer, counting hours, or the Creator who had already proven his attention was intimate? The earlier lines mattered. The God who knew the days was the same God who searched the heart, traveled into darkness, and formed the hidden life. Knowledge could not be separated from presence. Still, the question remained, and it deserved more than a quick answer. It was one thing to believe God saw her hidden beginning. It was another to believe he had seen every painful day ahead. Hannah pressed her palm against the page as if to steady it. If all her days were known, what did God know about the day that broke her heart? There are days we would remove from our story if we could. Days marked by a phone call, a diagnosis, a goodbye, a door closing, a truth arriving too late. We do not remember them as ordinary dates. We remember the light in the room, the clothes we were wearing, the exact place our body stood when life divided into before and after. When Psalm 139 speaks of all our days being known, it reaches directly into those memories. And for anyone who has suffered, the comfort of being seen quickly becomes a harder question. If God knew this day was coming, why did he not stop it? Hannah did not ask the question aloud at first. She sat with her hand resting on the page, listening to the hospital wake around her. A telephone rang twice in the corridor. Someone laughed near the elevators. The smell of fresh coffee drifted under the door. Morning was beginning to gather on the other side of the walls, but the chapel remained suspended in its amber light. The line about her days had opened an old argument inside her. During Ruth's illness, Hannah had prayed with determination. She set alarms so she would remember medication and alarms so she would remember prayer. She wrote names of doctors in a notebook and Bible verses on index cards. She searched for stories of recovery late at night, reading testimonies until hope felt almost like a method. If another person had been healed, perhaps Ruth could be. If enough people prayed, perhaps the outcome would change. If Hannah believed without allowing doubt to enter, perhaps faith itself could become a kind of protection. She knew better, professionally. She had cared for faithful people who recovered and faithful people who did not. She had watched families pray with confidence, with desperation, with confusion, and with no words at all. She would never tell a patient that illness remained because their faith was insufficient, yet when the patient was her mother, Hannah quietly placed that burden on herself. She remembered one particular night, 3 weeks before Ruth died. The hospital room was dark except for the monitor and the city lights beyond the window. Ruth slept unevenly. Hannah sat in the chair with an index card between both hands. On it she had written a promise about asking, seeking, and knocking. She repeated the words until they became a rhythm. Then she made a private bargain. God, I will do anything. Just give us more time. The prayer was not wrong because it was desperate. Desperation is often the most honest form of prayer. But beneath it was the belief that Hannah could offer enough goodness to purchase an answer. She promised to serve more, complain less, forgive faster, attend church every week, stop wasting time, become whatever God required. She placed her future on an invisible altar and waited for a transaction. Ruth grew weaker. After the funeral, Hannah carried not only grief but spiritual failure. She wondered whether she had doubted at the wrong moment. She remembered every impatient thought, every morning she was too tired to pray, every time fear had sounded louder than hope. She would have rejected that logic for anyone else, but grief is skilled at creating private rules. It tells us that if we can identify our mistake, then the world will feel controllable again. Guilt can be easier to bear than helplessness. If Hannah had failed, then at least the outcome made sense. But if she had loved, prayed, served, and still lost Ruth, then she had to live in a world where devotion did not guarantee the result she wanted. That uncertainty frightened her more than blame. Well-meaning people tried to comfort her. One woman at the funeral squeezed Hannah's hands and said, "God needed her more than we did." Hannah knew the woman intended kindness, but the sentence made God sound like a thief competing for love. A man from church told her, "Everything happens for a reason." Perhaps he meant that no suffering is beyond redemption, but in that moment, the words felt like a lid placed over a question too painful to hear. Another friend said, "At least she is not suffering now." That was true. It was also not enough. The truth of Ruth's peace did not erase the truth of Hannah's absence. Some sentences may contain theology and still arrive without tenderness. Truth is not only about accuracy. It is also about timing, humility, and love. A correct idea used to silence grief can become a burden rather than a light. The people who helped Hannah most were not the ones who explained. They were the ones who stayed long enough to admit they did not understand. Psalm 139 did not explain Ruth's death either. Hannah noticed that with relief. The psalm did not pause to provide a theory of suffering. It did not tell David why every painful day existed. It made a different promise. No day was unknown. No hour surprised God. No darkness erased the person within it. The psalm offered presence before explanation. That distinction mattered. To say a day is known by God is not the same as saying every wound within it is good. Human cruelty does not become holy because God foresaw it. Disease does not become beautiful because God remains present. Neglect, betrayal, violence, and death are not renamed as blessings simply because grace can work among their ruins. Christian hope does not require us to call darkness light. It declares that darkness will not have the final word. Hannah had spent months searching for a reason large enough to justify loss. Perhaps no explanation could make her glad Ruth died. Perhaps that was not the goal. Love should resist the easy acceptance of death. Grief exists because something precious has been taken from ordinary reach. Even Jesus, standing before the tomb of a friend, did not treat sorrow as an intellectual error. He wept. The memory of that gospel scene came to Hannah unexpectedly. She had heard it since childhood, but now one detail stood out. Jesus knew resurrection was coming, and still he wept. Knowledge did not cancel compassion. Seeing the ending did not make the pain of the moment unworthy of tears. If that was true, then God's knowledge of Ruth's final day did not mean he watched without feeling. Divine understanding was not cold awareness. The God revealed in Christian faith entered suffering rather than explaining it from a safe distance. He knew grief not only as an observer but as one who had wept, been wounded, and stood within death's shadow. Hannah looked toward the cross at the front of the chapel. Until then, it had been part of the room's furniture, familiar enough to disappear. Now she saw its shape differently. Christianity did not place at its center a God untouched by human pain. It placed a wounded Savior. Whatever else Hannah could not understand, the cross prevented her from imagining that God considered suffering trivial. This did not answer why Ruth was not healed in the way Hannah requested. It did answer something about the character of the one who heard Mammoty. There is a difference between not receiving the answer we wanted and not being heard. The two feel identical in the first hours of disappointment. Prayer rises, the outcome remains, and silence seems to prove that no one listened. But Scripture contains prayers of faithful people who cried for change and received presence before resolution. Faith is not a guarantee that every door opens. It is the trust that no honest cry is lost. Hannah thought again of Ruth's final night. Her prayer had been one word: please. She had judged it as incomplete. She had imagined better Christians would have spoken peace into the room, quoted promises, or surrendered with beautiful dignity. She had only held a hand and begged inwardly. Now she wondered whether the hand itself had been prayer. Love was in the grip of Park. Pleading was in the silence. Years of daughterhood were in the way Hannah's thumb moved across Ruth's knuckles. God, who knew the word before it reached the tongue, did not require sound to understand. Perhaps heaven had received a prayer too deep for grammar. The idea softened a place inside Hannah that had remained rigid since the funeral. She had accused herself of spiritual failure because she could not produce sacred language. But God had not asked her to narrate the holy moment. He had asked nothing. He had allowed her to be a daughter, holding her mother's hand. "You heard that?" Hannah whispered. She looked at her own hand now, open on the Bible. "You heard what I could not say." No feeling rushed over her. No answer entered with certainty. Yet the words no longer sounded like a question. They sounded like the beginning of trust. Trust is sometimes imagined as confidence about outcomes, but deeper trust may be confidence about character when outcomes remain unexplained. Hannah did not know why one patient recovered and another did not. She did not know why Daniel's fear kept him away until it was too late. She did not know why Ruth's life ended when it did. She could not trace the line between divine knowledge and human freedom, between a broken creation and God's redeeming will. The mystery remained a mystery. What changed was the presence within it. The day was known, therefore Hannah had not entered it alone. The day was known, therefore her one-word prayer had not vanished. The day was known, therefore Ruth had never become only a diagnosis in God's sight. The day was known, therefore even grief could not erase Hannah from the story God still held. The line about all her days also challenged the way Hannah viewed the future. Since Ruth's death, she had thought of life as a series of responsibilities extending into grey distance. Work, bills, empty holidays, conversations with Daniel postponed until neither of them remembered how to begin. She was not actively hopeless, she simply expected little. Hope felt dangerous because hope creates something that can be lost. But if God knew the days before Hannah did, then the future was not an unoccupied space she had to enter alone. The God who had been present in the secret beginning and the darkest night was already familiar with mornings Hannah had not yet seen. That did not mean each morning would be easy. It meant no morning would be godless. Hannah pictured the weeks ahead, returning to the apartment, opening Ruth's closet, deciding what to keep, answering Daniel if he called, perhaps speaking the truth without knowing how he would respond. None of those days felt safe, yet safety, she was beginning to see, was not the absence of pain, it was the presence of a love deeper than pain. David then turned from the days of his life to the thoughts of God. He described them as precious and beyond counting, more numerous than sand. Hannah paused over the image. As a child, she had spent one summer week at the coast with Ruth and Daniel. Ruth woke them before sunrise and led them barefoot across cold sand. Daniel ran toward the waves. Hannah stayed beside her mother, gathering shells with tiny holes near the center. She remembered kneeling and trying to count the grains stuck to her wet hand. She reached 30, lost track, and began again. "Some things are not meant to be counted," Ruth said. "Then how do you know there are a lot?" Hannah asked. Ruth laughed. Because you can stop counting and still be surrounded. In the chapel, the memory seemed almost like an answer sent forward through time. Hannah had imagined God's attention as occasionally, perhaps he noticed during prayer, worship, crisis, or moral failure. Perhaps he turned toward her when she became especially faithful or especially desperate. But David's image suggested an attention without gaps, thoughts more numerous than sand, not a brief divine glance, not reluctant concern, an abundance beyond calculation. You can stop counting and still be surrounded. What would it mean to believe that God's thoughts toward her were not mostly disappointment? Hannah realized that when she heard the phrase, "God knows everything," she instinctively imagined a record of mistakes. Knowledge felt like an audit. But David called God's thoughts precious. His awareness was not merely accurate, it was valuable, intimate, astonishing. The God who knew Hannah was not waiting for her to fail so he could confirm a suspicion. He knew the courage hidden inside exhaustion. He knew the love beneath the clumsy prayer. He knew every act of care no one thanked her for. He knew where grief had distorted her thinking and where grace had kept her tender. He knew the woman she had been, the woman she was, and the woman healing might allow her to become. More than sand. The image expanded beyond Hannah area. Every person in the hospital lay within an attention that did not diminish by being shared. The newborn whose cry had entered the chapel, Mrs. Callahan afraid of words left unsaid, Miguel with the linens, Lila, who had knelt beside Hannah months before, Daniel asleep or awake somewhere across the city, each life known personally, each story held without confusing one with another. Human attention is exhausted by numbers. We hear of thousands suffering and become numb. We see crowded rooms and reduce people to categories. God does not. Infinite knowledge is not mass awareness. It is perfect particularity multiplied without loss. Hannah found herself thinking of all the people who feared they had been forgotten because no one called. The elderly person eating alone, the young adult whose family rejected them, the caregiver whose name never appeared in the story, the worker cleaning after everyone left, the believer who prayed for years and felt no change. Psalm 139 did not promise they would always be recognized by the world. It promised their invisibility to others did not become invisibility to God. A warmth moved through Hannah, not an emotion she could force, but a quiet release. For months she had held one image of God, distant, informed, silent. The psalm offered another, intimate, present, thinking thoughts too numerous to count. This did not mean she suddenly understood how providence worked. Some mysteries remain too large for language, and pretending otherwise can injure the people we hope to comfort. Hannah could not say whether Ruth's final day had been permitted, appointed, foreseen, or woven through a freedom and brokenness beyond her understanding. She knew only what the psalm itself insisted upon. The day had never escaped God's sight, and the people inside it had never escaped his care. That was enough for one morning. Faith is sometimes asked to carry more than it should. People demand that it provide a complete map when what the heart needs first is a hand. They ask grief to become wisdom before grief has finished speaking. But trust can begin without a map. A child walking through fog does not need to see the whole road if the hand holding theirs is steady. The fog remains. The road remains. The next step becomes possible. Hannah thought of the future again. But this time she allowed one ordinary image to appear. Sunlight on her apartment floor. Ruth's blue scarf folded rather than abandoned over the chair. A pot of coffee made for no emergency. Her phone resting nearby without controlling the room. Nothing about the image was spectacular. No dramatic healing. No life restored to its previous shape. It was simply a morning in which grief existed without owning every object. Could God already see that day too? Perhaps among the days known to him were not only the days that broke her heart, but the days that would slowly teach it to live again. Days when she would laugh without guilt. Days when she would tell a story about Ruth and feel gratitude before pain. Days when Daniel might sit across from her and finally speak. Days when the scar remained but no longer dictated every movement. Hope did not require Hannah to predict which of those days would come or how. It required only the refusal to believe that the worst day was the final definition of the story. A known future meant grief did not stand at the end of the road as the only certainty. God did. She had been asking why God knew the day of loss. The psalm quietly invited another question. What days of mercy did he also know that she could not yet imagine? Hannah let that question remain open. It was not an answer disguised as optimism. It was a window. For months, she had treated the future as an empty room. Now she considered that grace might already be waiting there in forms she could not name. She turned the page, then the tone changed. The language that followed was sharp. David spoke of evil, bloodshed, enemies, and hatred. The peaceful movement from formation to precious thoughts seemed to break open into anger. Hannah's eyes stopped. She remembered these lines now. They were the part people rarely printed on cards, the part skipped in comforting readings, the part that made Psalm 139 feel less safe. How could the same person who had just marveled at God's tender knowledge speak with such fury? Hannah almost closed the Bible. She was tired, and the gentler verses had already given her more than she expected. But something in the abruptness felt honest. Human hearts do not move in straight lines. Awe can stand beside anger. Gratitude can live beside grief. A person can recognize beauty and still rage at what has broken it. Perhaps these difficult lines did not interrupt the psalm. Perhaps they revealed the reason its final prayer was necessary. Hannah read David's anger and felt her own answer from the dark. She had wanted a God who understood every hidden feeling. Now the page was about to show what happens when the feeling hidden deepest is not sadness, but rage. And the question was no longer whether God had seen the day that wounded her. The question was what he would do with the wound that had begun to shape her heart. The most dangerous emotions are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes anger shouts, breaks things, and announces itself. But sometimes anger becomes polite. It answers messages with one word. It says, "No problem," while carefully remembering every problem. It performs kindness without warmth and calls distance maturity. Because it does not look violent, we assume it is harmless. Yet quiet resentment can shape a life as surely as open rage. It can become the hidden architect of decisions, relationships, and prayers. Psalm 139 does not leave that room locked. Hannah read the difficult lines again. David spoke with fierce hatred toward those he saw as enemies of God. The words felt jarring after the tenderness of being formed and known. Modern readers often move quickly past them. They quote the beautiful beginning and the peaceful ending, while leaving the anger in the middle unexamined. Hannah understood why. She wanted a psalm that comforted her, not one that reflected a part of the heart she was trying not to see. Yet the Bible's honesty was one reason the words carried weight. It did not preserve only the emotions people were proud to show. Its prayers included joy, confusion, doubt, protest, exhaustion, and anger. Faithful people did not always approach God with balanced sentences. They came wounded, frightened, and morally outraged. Scripture did not pretend the human heart became simple in God's presence. That did not mean every emotion was a command. A prayer can reveal what is inside us without declaring that every desire inside us is good. David's anger was brought before God, where it could be seen, judged, and transformed. He did not need to hide it beneath religious politeness. The psalm's final movement would prove that even righteous certainty needed searching. Hannah looked at the line where David separated himself from evil. She recognized the impulse. When we have been wounded, we want the story arranged clearly. There are those who did right and those who did wrong, those who stayed and those who left, the faithful and the faithless, the injured and the guilty. Clear categories protect us from confusion. They also protect us from seeing the ways pain has crossed the boundary and entered us. Hannah had made Daniel the absent brother and herself the faithful daughter. The descriptions contained truth. She had stayed, he had often been absent, she had handled appointments, meals, medication, insurance calls, and nights when Ruth was afraid. Daniel had missed more than he knew, but over time, Hannah had turned true facts into complete identities. Daniel became only what he failed to do. Hannah became only what she endured. Complete knowledge belonged to God. But Hannah had been acting as though it belonged to her. She opened the messages on her phone. Daniel's name appeared above a thread of short exchanges. Most were practical. "Did you find Mom's insurance papers?" "Yes." "I sent copies." "Can we talk about the house next week?" "I am working." "Send me a time." "Sorry, busy here too." The last message was from 3 days ago. "We will figure it out." Hannah stared at it. The phrase made her angry because it sounded effortless. "We will figure it out." As if they stood on equal sides of the problem. As if we had existed during the months when Hannah slept in hospital chairs. She began typing. "You keep saying we, but there was no we when she needed us." Her thumb hovered above the screen. She added another sentence. "You arrived after she died, and I have been cleaning up everything ever since." The words were true, but they were sharpened to wound. Hannah could feel the difference. Truth seeks clarity. Resentment seeks impact. Both may use the same facts. She deleted the message. Then she was angry that she had deleted it. Forgiveness is often misunderstood as the refusal to speak honestly. People imagine that a forgiving person never names harm, never asks for change, and never establishes a boundary. But silence is not always forgiveness. Sometimes silence is fear wearing a halo. Hannah had remained silent partly because she did not want conflict, and partly because unspoken anger allowed her to remain morally superior. As long as Daniel never knew the case against him, he could never answer it. Hannah could keep winning alone. The realization stung. She wanted to believe her silence had protected him. Some of it had. Daniel had grieved too, and the days after Ruth's death were not the time for every accusation. But months had passed. The silence now protected Hannah from vulnerability. To tell Daniel the truth, she would have to risk hearing his truth. She would have to admit that beneath anger she missed him. She would have to surrender the imagined conversation in which he finally said everything exactly right. Real people rarely apologize as perfectly as injured hearts rehearse. Hannah set the phone beside the Bible. She looked toward the cross again. Christian forgiveness was not denial, and it was not instant emotional warmth. At its center was the refusal to let another person's sin become the permanent ruler of one's soul. It could include confrontation, it could include consequences, it could require distance for safety, but it released the right to make vengeance the final purpose of truth. Hannah was not seeking revenge in any dramatic sense. She did not want Daniel ruined. She wanted him to feel what she had felt. She wanted him to enter the hospital room in memory and discover that it was too late. She wanted the weight transferred. That desire was understandable. It was also making her carry the weight twice. Every night she replayed his failure. She returned to the room. Every imagined argument tied her future to the moment of his absence. Resentment promised to keep the wound from being minimized, but its method was to keep the wound open. It said, "If you heal, perhaps what happened will no longer matter." So Hannah preserved the pain as evidence. God did not ask her to say the pain did not matter. He asked whether bitterness was the only trustworthy witness. The psalm had shown that God saw everything. If God remembered the hospital room, Hannah did not have to injure herself in order to prove it existed. If God knew what Daniel did and did not do, Hannah did not need to hold a private trial forever. Divine memory made release possible. The wound could be entrusted without being erased. This is one of the hardest forms of faith, believing God can hold the truth when we loosen our grip on it. Hannah whispered, "I do not know how to forgive him." The prayer felt more honest than saying she had forgiven. "I do not even know if he is sorry." She waited, then added, "And part of me does not want peace unless he hurts first." There it was. The darkest sentence in the room did not come from David's ancient anger. It came from Hannah's own mouth. She expected shame. Instead, she felt grief. The desire to make Daniel hurt was not the whole truth about her. It was the cry of a wounded part that believed pain was the only language strong enough to communicate pain. Once spoken, it sounded less powerful. It sounded tired. God already knew it. That fact changed confession doc. Hannah was not presenting new evidence to a shocked judge. She was agreeing with the one who had seen the hidden room and remained near. Confession was not the moment God discovered the truth. It was the moment Hannah stopped spending energy denying it. The psalm moved toward its final lines. "Search me," David prayed. "Know my heart. Test my anxious thoughts. See whether there is a harmful way in me. Lead me in the everlasting way." Hannah read them once, then again. Something about the structure caught her attention. She turned back to the beginning. "You have searched me and known me." Then she returned to the end. "Search me and know me." The same idea appeared twice, but the posture had changed. At the beginning, being searched was a fact. God had done it. David stood beneath a knowledge he could not escape. At the end, being searched became an invitation. David asked for what he already knew was happening. He moved from exposure to trust, from the realization that God saw everything to the willingness that God should reveal what the seeing meant. This was the hidden journey of Psalm 139. It was not merely a poem about divine knowledge. It was the transformation of a person who learned that God's knowledge was safe enough to welcome. David began by saying, "You know me." He ended by saying, "Then show me what I do not know about myself." Hannah felt the significance slowly. Most people want God to search the parts of life that hurt them. Search the injustice, search the betrayal, search the person who failed. Vindicate me, explain this, make them understand. Those prayers are not wrong. God cares about truth and justice. But the psalm does not end with David asking God to search his enemies. It ends with David placing his own heart beneath the light. That turn requires courage. It is easier to ask why another person acted than to ask what their action has awakened in us. Easier to identify another's absence than our own control. Easier to confess sadness than the pride built around sadness. Yet the God who searches is not looking for a reason to humiliate. His purpose appears in the final request. Lead me. God searches in order to lead. A surgeon examines a wound not to mock the injured body, but to remove what prevents healing. A guide studies the lost traveler's position not to shame them for wandering, but to find the path home. In Psalm 139, exposure and guidance belong together. The divine gaze is restorative. Hannah had imagined that if God revealed the full condition of her heart, she would collapse beneath guilt. But the psalm's ending pointed toward movement. There was a way forward. Not a way that denied the past, but a way that did not remain trapped inside it. "Search me," she whispered. The words caught in her throat. She tried again. "Search me." No thunder answered. The chapel lamp did not flicker. yet the prayer felt like opening a door from the inside. Hannah began naming what she wanted God to show her. The fear beneath her constant work, the pride inside being needed, the anger toward Daniel, the guilt surrounding Ruth's death, the belief that rest had to be earned, the suspicion that God loved her most when she was useful. Each confession felt connected, part of the same hidden system. She saw how one wound had strengthened another. Their father had left when Hannah was young, and she had learned that dependable people could disappear. Ruth's illness had awakened the old fear. Daniel's absence had confirmed it. Hannah responded by becoming indispensable. If she could be needed enough, perhaps no one would leave. When Ruth died anyway, the entire system failed. Hannah had been angry not only because Daniel was absent. She was angry because all her faithfulness had not granted control over loss. The insight hurt, but it also brought clarity. She had loved Ruth truly. Her care was not false, yet mixed into love was a desperate attempt to prevent the future. Human motives are often braided this way: generosity and fear, devotion and control, faith and bargaining. Complete knowledge does not reduce the good because it sees the mixture. It purifies the good from what has made it heavy. "I wanted to save her," Hannah said, "and when I could not, I blamed him because blaming him was easier than admitting I could not save her." Tears filled her eyes again. Daniel had failed her. That remained true, but he had become the container for more than his failure. Hannah had placed helplessness, death, anger at God, and anger at herself inside the case against him. No apology from Daniel could carry all of that. She had been waiting for a human confession to solve a grief larger than one human being. The searchlight of grace did not make Daniel innocent. It made the story more complete. A childhood image returned to Hannah. She and Daniel were standing beneath the dining room table while a storm shook the windows. Their father had been gone for 2 weeks, though no one had yet said he would not return. Daniel was 6 and crying so hard he could barely breathe. Hannah, 10 years old and already trying to become dependable, wrapped a blanket around both of them. Daniel asked whether the storm could take the house. Hannah told him no, though she did not know. Then he asked whether their father knew where to find them. Hannah had no answer for that. For years, Daniel followed Hannah from room to room. He hated sleeping alone. He called her when he failed his first driving test and when his college application was rejected. He could be selfish, but he could also be tender. When Hannah broke her wrist at 16, he carried her books for a month and threatened anyone who laughed at the awkward cast. At Ruth's birthday dinners, he always remembered the kind of cake she liked. The absent brother at the hospital was not the only Daniel who had ever existed. Remembering the good did not cancel the harm. It prevented harm from becoming the entire name of a person. This was part of forgiveness too, refusing to reduce someone to the worst chapter they wrote, even while asking them to take responsibility for it. God had not reduced Hannah to her resentment. Could she begin to stop reducing Daniel to his fear? She wondered what his final weeks with Ruth had looked like from inside his own lifestyle. Perhaps he had avoided the hospital because watching their father leave had taught him that pain could be escaped by leaving first. Perhaps work truly had been overwhelming. Perhaps he was ashamed after every missed visit and found shame easier to repeat than to confess. These possibilities did not excuse him. Hannah did not know whether any were true. Complete knowledge was God's, not hers. That recognition invited questions where certainty had previously closed the door. What happened to you was not the same as what you did was acceptable. Compassion and accountability could stand in the same room. Jesus could tell the truth about sin without denying the person beneath it. Hannah could ask Daniel to face his absence while remaining open to the story that produced it. She also understood that reconciliation required two people. Forgiveness could release her from vengeance, but it could not force Daniel to become honest. If he dismissed her pain, she might need boundaries. If he apologized, trust would still grow slowly. Peace did not mean returning to the same pattern. The everlasting way was not a road back into silence. It was a road where truth and mercy walked together. Hannah picked up the phone and opened a blank message. She did not know what reconciliation would look like. She did not know whether Daniel would respond defensively or disappear again. Forgiveness could begin in her heart without guaranteeing trust would be rebuilt quickly. Trust required truth, consistency, and time. She typed slowly. I have been carrying a lot of hurt from Mon's final months. I have told you I was fine, but I was not. I do not want to keep pretending, and I do not want anger to be the only thing between us. She stopped. The message looked vulnerable in a way accusation did not. An accusation offered armor. Honesty revealed need. She added, "When you are ready, I think we need to talk about what happened. I need you to listen, and I will try to listen too." Her thumb hovered above send. 1,000 fears appeared. What if he ignored it? What if he said she was unfair? What if he apologized badly? What if he revealed pain she had not considered? What if the conversation changed nothing? The everlasting way did not promise control over another person's response. It promised guidance for Hannah's next faithful step. She lowered the phone without sending the message yet. Not every act of courage must be rushed. Prayer sometimes creates a pause between reaction and action, a place where truth can lose its weapon and keep its strength. Hannah wanted to read the message once more after the sun rose. She wanted to make sure it invited honesty rather than disguised punishment. The chapel clock showed 5:18. A faint grey light had begun to gather at the window. Night was loosening its hold on the city. Hannah looked at the first and last lines of the psalm again. Searched and known. Search and know. The journey between them was the journey from fear to consent. At first, Hannah wanted God to see her because she felt invisible. Then she feared what his sight included. Slowly, she discovered that complete knowledge did not drive him away. Now the question was whether she would let that knowledge lead her out of the patterns that had kept her safe and imprisoned at the same time. God sees us before anyone else does. But the comfort of that truth is not only that our pain has a witness, it is that our hearts have a healer. Hannah closed her eyes and prayed the final lines in her own words. Know what frightens me. Show me what is harming me. Lead me where resentment cannot lead. Teach me the way that does not end at this wound. When she opened her eyes, the phone still rested beside the Bible, the unsent message glowing on the screen. Morning was coming. And for the first time, Hannah understood that being fully seen was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of being led. Morning does not ask the night for permission. It begins at the edge of things, quietly, almost invisibly. A window turns from black to grey. The outline of a building returns. Rain becomes individual drops instead of one continuous darkness. Nothing announces the exact second night loses its authority, but slowly the world can be seen again. When Hannah lifted her eyes from Psalm 139, dawn had begun gathering over the hospital, and the room she entered in darkness was changing around her. The lamp near the cross still burned, but it no longer held back the whole night. Pale light came through the high window and rested on the floorboards. Dust moved in the narrow beam. Beyond the chapel door, The hospital was entering its daily rhythm. Elevators opened more often. Shoes moved quickly along the corridor. Someone pushed a breakfast cart past the wall, and the smell of toast briefly entered the room. Hannah had been in the chapel for less than 2 hours. It felt as though she had crossed years. Nothing outside her had been repaired. Ruth was still gone. Daniel had not yet read the message because Hannah had not sent it. The apartment remained quiet. The boxes waited. Her exhaustion had not vanished. Faith had not erased consequence or turned grief into a lesson with a clean ending. Yet Hannah was no longer sitting inside the same story. When she entered, the story was simple. She had been faithful. Others had failed. God had been silent, and she was alone. The facts beneath that story mattered, but Psalm 139 had widened the frame. It revealed a God present before the beginning, within the ordinary, across the distance, inside the darkness, and beneath every unspoken thought. It revealed pain without reducing Hannah to pain. It revealed resentment without reducing her to resentment. It showed that being known was not a verdict. It was an invitation to be led. Hannah looked at the message on her phone. I have been carrying a lot of hurt from Mom's final months. I have told you I was fine, but I was not. I do not want to keep pretending, and I do not want anger to be the only thing between us. When you are ready, I think we need to talk about what happened. I need you to listen, and I will try to listen too. The words were not perfect. No sentence could hold the hospital room, the missed calls, the funeral, the months of silence, and the childhood beneath them. But the words were true. Mrs. Callahan's question returned, "What if I say it wrong?" Hannah remembered her own answer. You do not have to say it perfectly. You only have to say what is true. She pressed send. The message left the screen with no sound dramatic enough for the moment. A small word appeared beneath it. Delivered. That was all. Hannah placed the phone face down. She did not watch for the typing symbol. She did not build a new courtroom around the speed of Daniel's response. The next step belonged to him. Her step had been honesty without cruelty. The outcome remained outside her control. This is often what guidance looks like. We want the everlasting way to appear as a bright road stretching to the horizon, every turn visible. More often, God gives enough light for one faithful movement. Make the call, tell the truth, rest today, ask for help, release the sentence you keep rehearsing, return to prayer without pretending, forgive again, establish the boundary, receive the kindness. Take the next step before you know the fifth. Hannah read the final prayer once more. Search me. Know my anxious thoughts. Show me the harmful way. Lead me. Anxiety had been one of the hidden forces shaping her life. She worried that love would disappear if she stopped being useful. She worried that grief would consume her if she allowed it to speak. She worried that forgiveness would make the wound meaningless. She worried that God had remained silent because she had failed him. Each fear had offered a strategy: work harder, stay busy, hold the evidence, avoid the room. The strategies had kept her functioning. They had not made her free. God's guidance did not shame Hannah for how she survived. Grace is gentle with the shelters we build in storms. It understands why the wall went up. But grace also knows when the storm has passed and the shelter has become too small for life. It invites us outside, not because we were foolish to hide, but because hiding is no longer the only way to remain safe. Hannah had hidden inside strength. Now she was being led toward honesty. She closed the Bible, but kept one hand on its cover. For a moment, she thought of the countless hands that had touched it before hers. Families waiting for surgery, patients afraid of results, workers exhausted after midnight, people who believed strongly and people who did not know what they believed. Each had entered with a different story. The pages had not promised identical outcomes. They had offered the same presence. God knew. The words no longer sounded like surveillance.
God knew the child beneath the yellow star quilt.
He knew the young woman praised for needing nothing. He knew the nurse moving through hallways with cold coffee. He knew the daughter holding Ruth's hand. He knew the sister composing accusations. He knew the woman learning to receive grace. No chapter surprised him. No version of Hannah had to be edited before entering his presence. And because he knew, she could stop explaining herself into worthiness.
The chapel door opened. Miguel leaned inside.
Now, without the stack of linens, "The alive coffee did not kill you?" Hannah smiled. "It came close." He nodded toward the window. Rain stopped. "I see that." Miguel studied her for a second, not intrusively. "You look different." Hannah almost answered with something easy, "Just tired, long night." Instead, she said, "I think I finally stopped running for a minute." Miguel did not ask from what. Perhaps he understood that some truths need no immediate explanation. "That sounds tiring too," he said. "It was..." He smiled and let the door close. Hannah laughed softly. Then she stood. Her knees protested after so long on the bench. She picked up the empty cup, returned the Bible to the shelf, and looked once more toward the cross.
She had entered the chapel wanting a sign that God saw her.
No spectacular sign had come. There had been a worn Bible, an elderly patient, bad coffee, a newborn's cry, remembered kindnesses, and words written centuries before her birth. Yet together they had become something more trustworthy than spectacle. They had revealed a pattern of presence. Miracles are not always the suspension of natural law. Sometimes the miracle is that a heart hardened by pain becomes willing to tell the truth without using truth as a weapon. Sometimes it is that a grieving person discovers the ability to imagine another morning. Sometimes it is that scripture, read many times, suddenly reads the reader. Sometimes it is that God does not remove the past, but loosens its grip on the future. Hannah stepped into the corridor. Daylight came through the windows at the far end. Nurses from the morning shift moved toward their stations. A physician carried 2 cups of coffee, one balanced dangerously on a folder. A father from the waiting area stood stretching beside his sleeping son. The same hospital that had looked ghostly at 4 in the morning now filled with names, questions, footsteps, and plans. Hannah saw people differently.
Every face contained a hidden life.
The woman checking her phone might be waiting for news. The man cleaning the floor might be carrying a prayer no one had heard. The young doctor might be afraid of making a mistake. The receptionist smiling at strangers might have cried before coming to work. Human beings passed one another every day with oceans concealed beneath ordinary expressions. Psalm 139 did not give Hannah the ability to know those oceans books. It gave her a reason to treat them with reverence. Book. God knew what she did not book. Complete divine knowledge became a call to human gentleness. She stopped near room 314. Mrs. Callahan's daughter was awake now. Sitting close to the bed, their hands were joined. Hannah could not hear the conversation through the partially closed door, but the daughter was crying, and Mrs. Callahan was speaking. Perhaps the important words had begun, but Hannah did not interrupt. She moved on. Near the staff station, Lila was finishing notes from the night shift. Hannah had worked beside her many times since Ruth died, without mentioning what she remembered. She stood beside the desk until Lila looked up. "Everything okay?" Lila asked. "Yes." Hannah paused. "I never thanked you." Lila frowned gently. "For what?" "The night my mother died. You brought a lamp. You told me I did not have to leave until I was ready." Recognition moved across Lila's face. "Hannah, you did not need to thank me. I know." Hannah felt tears near again, but she did not look away. I needed you to know I remember. Lila reached across the desk and covered Hannah's hand. I remember too. For a moment, they stood without speaking. The kindness Hannah had once overlooked returned to its giver. Grace moved in a circle. One person had made space in darkness. Months later, another named the light. Hannah continued toward the exit. At the end of the corridor, sunlight touched the wet parking lot. Every car carried a small reflection of the sky. The storm had washed the city without making it new. Puddles remained. Broken branches lay near the curb, but light reached all of it. Her phone vibrated. Hannah stopped beneath the red exit sign where she had stood earlier. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. For 1 second, fear returned with full strength. She considered waiting. Then she opened the message. I know you are not fine. I think I knew and was too ashamed to ask. I was afraid of seeing Mom like that, and I left you alone with what I would not face. I am sorry. I do not expect that to fix it. I will listen. Can I call tonight? Hannah read it twice. The apology was not perfect. It did not contain every detail she had imagined. It did not return the missed hours, but it did something resentment had said would never happen. It acknowledged the truth. Hannah did not feel instant reconciliation. Pain and relief existed together. Trust had not been restored by one message. A conversation waited, perhaps many conversations, yet the door was no longer sealed. She replied, "Tonight is okay." Then she put the phone away. There are moments when grace feels less like a rival and more like space. Space where only anger existed. Space for another person's repentance. Space for boundaries and compassion. Space for grief to remain without controlling every decision. Space for God to lead in ways the heart could not imagine while it was defending itself. Hannah walked outside. The air was cool and smelled of wet pavement and leaves. Clouds were breaking above the buildings. She stood beneath the hospital awning and breathed as though she had been indoors for much longer than one night. In the parking lot, people hurried under umbrellas they no longer needed. A bus sighed at the curb. Water moved along the gutter in bright streams. Hannah could hear birds beginning in the trees near the entrance, their song tentative after the storm. She thought of the psalm from beginning to end. You have searched me. You know when I sit and rise. You understand the thought before I speak. Wherever I go, you are there. Darkness cannot hide me. You saw me before anyone else did. My days are known. Your thoughts cannot be counted. Search me again. Lead me. The psalm did not describe a God who noticed Hannah only when she entered a chapel. It described the God who had been present in every place she brought into the chapel. Prayer had not summoned him from a distance. Prayer had awakened Hannah to a presence already surrounding her. Perhaps this is the truth someone listening needs today. You may feel forgotten because the person who promised to stay left. You may feel unseen because your work is hidden, your grief is private, or your prayers seem to disappear into silence. You may have spent years being useful while wondering whether anyone would love you if you stopped carrying everything. You may be ashamed of thoughts you have never spoken. You may believe the darkest chapter has become your name. Psalm 139 does not ask you to deny any of that. It asks you to consider a deeper reality. Before anyone approved of you, God saw you. Before anyone rejected you, God knew you. Before you learn to perform, hide, achieve, apologize, or protect yourself, your life was present to Him. He knows the sentence you cannot finish. He knows why the memory still hurts. He knows the good motive and the frightened motive braided together. He knows where you were wounded and what the wound has begun to teach you. His knowledge is not shallow enough to confuse your worst moment with your entire identity. You do not have to make your pain dramatic for God to take it seriously. You do not have to make your prayer beautiful for God to understand it. You do not have to become strong before coming near. The God who saw your hidden beginning is not intimidated by the hidden places now. And being seen by Him does not mean being watched for failure. It means no tear is misplaced in the universe. No act of love disappears because no one thanked you. No night becomes truly godless because you could not feel His presence. No road carries you outside the reach of the hand that formed you. This does not mean every prayer will be answered in the form you ask. It does not mean every relationship will be restored, every illness healed in this life, or every mystery explained. Christian hope is not a promise that pain becomes simple. It is the promise that pain is not sovereign. God remains. He remains when understanding fails. He remains when people misunderstand. He remains when the body weakens, when plans collapse, when grief changes the shape of a room. He remains close enough to search, gentle enough to lead, and faithful enough to continue the story beyond what you can presently see. The final prayer of Psalm 139 is therefore not a prayer of fear. It is a prayer of trust. For a Christian, that trust rests not only in the fact that God sees, but in the way He has chosen to come near. In Jesus, the God who knows the human heart did not remain outside human weakness. He entered an ordinary family, walked dusty roads, received the unwanted, touched the overlooked, and carried human sin and sorrow to the cross. The divine gaze was revealed not as contempt, but as mercy willing to bear the cost of bringing people home. This means being searched by God is not an invitation to despair over everything He finds. He already knows. Grace begins where hiding ends. The failure you confess is not a surprise that cancels His love. The shame you carry is not stronger than the forgiveness Christ offers. Repentance is not crawling toward a reluctant God. It is turning toward the one who has already moved toward you. Perhaps you have been afraid that if you become honest, even God will turn away. Psalm 139 gives no room for that illusion. He knew before you spoke. He saw before you admitted. And the Gospel declares that His answer to the truth of human brokenness was not abandonment, but a cross and an empty tomb. The God who searches is also the God who saves. Forgiveness does not call evil good. It names evil fully and refuses to let it own the final sentence. In Christ, mercy is not sentimental blindness. It is holy love looking directly at the wound, the guilt, the debt, and choosing redemption. That is why you can bring God both what was done to you and what has grown within you because of it. He is able to judge with truth, forgive with justice, and heal with patience. You may still need to apologize to someone. You may need to seek counsel, make restitution, accept consequences, or establish a boundary. Grace does not remove those faithful steps. It makes them possible without the crushing belief that your worst action has become your permanent name. Known is still deeper. Loved is still offered. Led is still possible. Search me, because your truth is safer than my hiding. Know my anxious thoughts, because I am tired of being ruled by them. Show me what is harming me, because grace wants more for me than survival. Lead me, because I do not need the whole road if your hand is present on the next step. Hannah reached her car and unlocked the door. Through the window, she could see Ruth's blue scarf folded on the passenger seat. Hannah had brought it weeks ago and never taken it back upstairs. She lifted it, pressed the soft fabric briefly to her face, then folded it more carefully and placed it beside her bag. She did not put grief away. She carried it differently. Before starting the engine, Hannah closed her eyes. God, she prayed, Thank you for seeing what I could not explain. Thank you for being present where I thought I was alone. Search what I still hide. Heal what I cannot heal by holding it tighter. Teach me to receive love without earning it. Teach me to speak truth without cruelty. Lead me through the days I understand and the days I do not. And when I forget that I am held, help me remember that your attention has never left me. She opened her eyes. Sunlight broke through the clouds and rested across the dashboard. It was only light, ordinary and ancient. Hannah did not need to call it anything else. She started the car. The road home was wet but visible. And wherever you are as these words end, in a quiet room, on a late drive, beside a hospital bed, beneath the weight of a memory, or at the beginning of a day you do not know how to face, the same truth remains. You were seen before the world knew how to look at you. You were known before anyone learned your name. You have never lived a single unseen day, and you will never take a single step beyond the reach of the God who knew you first.